Hey everybody, welcome back to our deep dive in the book of Luke. Today we are looking at a passage that many of us may know, but don't quite understand. It's an event called the Transfiguration of Jesus. Now, what we need to know about this event first is we need to understand the context of why this is here and what's happening around it. And so the basic story, which we'll talk about in a minute, is that Jesus goes up on a mountain and he brings with him Peter, James, and John. And as he goes up, the disciples fall asleep. And when they wake up, they see Jesus metamorphosized, is the Greek word, transformed, transfigured. And he's glowing, his face is changed, his clothes are bright like flashes of lightning, Luke tells us. And Moses and Elijah are there. The disciples are kind of bewildered, and Peter sort of just starts rambling and says, it's good for us to be here. Do you want us to set up tents for all of you people? And then a cloud envelops this group, and a voice from heaven speaks, "This is my son whom I've chosen, listen to him." And then as soon as the voice is done, Jesus is alone again. And then the disciples kept this to themselves and did not tell anyone. It's a bit of a strange story, right? But let's try to unpack this. So first, the context. Right before this passage and right after this passage, we have two discussions by Jesus with his disciples as to who Jesus is and what his purpose is. So we talked about this last week, if you were with us, where Jesus sort of asked the disciples, who do people say that I am? Peter says, some people think you're Elijah or one of the prophets. And then Peter says, I think you're the Messiah. And then Jesus tells him his purpose, that he's come to suffer and be rejected, but on the third day be raised to life, and what it means to follow him as his disciple. Immediately after this, we have a similar discussion with Jesus and his disciples about who he is and what his purpose is, about his death and resurrection. And the disciples this time don't seem to understand. They start arguing about who's going to be the greatest. So this transfiguration is couched in between these two different sections about Jesus trying to explain who he is and what his mission is. And so, in other words, that kind of gives us a sense of why this is here and what this is really about. That in these two discussions about Jesus's identity and his death and resurrection, the author Luke pauses to show us who Jesus is in all his glory in just a moment, in just a small moment. If you recall, at the end of the last section, after Jesus explains his mission and identity, he tells them that, verse 27 of Luke chapter 9, I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God. And what's the very next thing that happens? Well, they get a picture of that very kingdom of God in the flesh, right? Because we have a Jesus who's not meek and mild, but he's transformed, he's radiant, he's glowing. And we have these two Old Testament heroes, Moses and Elijah, who are not dead, like they've been long dead, but they are raised back to life, and they also have transformed bodies. And so the disciples are getting this picture of what the kingdom of God looks like in this scene and in this moment. But there's more to it than that. So there, as Jesus is changed or metamorphosized, as the Greek tells us, his face is changed, his clothes become bright as lightning. And Mark, I think, says that his clothes are so white, no one in the world could possibly bleach them to be that bright. What this is an allusion to when Moses goes up on the mountain to meet with God, and God passes by Moses as Moses sticks his face in the cleft of the rock. And then as Moses comes down the mountain, he is glowing and radiant, and the people of Israel don't even want to look at him. They're like, oh, you've been in God's presence. And that God's glory is reflecting off of you. And so this is a picture of Jesus experiencing the same thing. He is radiating the glory of God. But we're also meant to ask, well, why Moses and why Elijah? Well, Deuteronomy chapter 18 tells us that there is going to be a prophet like Moses who is greater than Moses, and when he comes, the people are called to listen to him. And Moses represents not only the law, but he represents kind of the foundation of Israel, right? The beginnings of Israel as a people, of God's people being formed in the desert. And so he kind of represents the start of the story of God. Elijah, on the other hand, he represents the end of the story of God. He also represents the prophets. So we have the law and the prophets, the two major sections of the Old Testament. But more than that, Elijah represents the fulfillment of God's kingdom coming. So you may remember Elijah didn't die. He was taken up in a cloud or in a whirlwind to heaven. And so this rumor came that Elijah never died, but he is going to come back. And even in Jewish practices today, when they celebrate, especially Passover, there is a cup and a place left at the Passover table, and there is a drink that is meant to be drunk or left for Elijah for his coming, as he is going to come back one day and restore the kingdom or announce the beginning of God's restoration. And so here we have the beginning of the story of God's people, and then with the fulfillment of the story of God's people in these two characters, Moses and Elijah. And they are hanging out with Jesus, who is the centerpiece of this story. That these two great Old Testament heroes are just kind of servants of this other hero, Jesus, who is the centerpiece of this whole story. Then we have this interesting thing of the disciples kind of falling asleep, and they wake up in the middle of all of this happening. And this is a continual theme of the disciples kind of missing out these very important moments of Jesus's story in revealing God's glory. The disciples fall asleep again in the Garden of Gethsemane, you may remember. And so there's something about this sleep that sort of indicates that even though they're there, they don't really understand what's going on. And this is reflected in Peter's statement, where he says, do you want us to set up some tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah? This is a reference back to a Jewish festival called the Festival of Booths or Tabernacles. It was one of the significant Jewish festivals or holy days where the people would camp outside, and they'd set up tents for themselves, and they would remember God's deliverance for them through the wilderness time and God's presence with them. And so Peter, even though he doesn't fully get it, understands this is a holy moment. And he's like, oh, we're celebrating this feast right here because God's presence is here with us. Is this what we're supposed to do? And then they hear this voice from God saying, this is my son whom I have chosen, listen to him, which echoes back to the voice that we hear in Jesus' baptism, reminding people who Jesus really is. Again, this is God's son, radiant, full of his glory. And we see these two Old Testament figures who represent the law, the prophets, the beginning of the story of God's people, and the fulfillment of the story of God's people here. And so a brief moment of the fullness of God's kingdom is seen by these disciples. And yet the story ends with them, instead of they've obviously misunderstood Jesus' identity prior to this. They misunderstand it again in the passages that follow. And here they see everything in its fullness. And how do they respond? It says the disciples kept this to themselves and did not tell anyone what they had seen. So here's a moment where you're supposed to reveal the truth. You're like, okay, now I know who Jesus is. He's the dying and resurrecting one. He is the Son of God who has come to bring fulfillment to God's kingdom. And I've now seen it with my own eyes. And they keep silent. So what do we learn about this? Well, we learn again about who Jesus' true identity is, and the way that it's couched between these two discussions Jesus has with his disciples. And this transfiguration in the middle is kind of the meat to show us that this is the reality of who Jesus is, the radiant, glorious Son of God who is coming to make all things right again. And he is the one who has power and glory and beauty and majesty and all of these things. And yet, we're also confronted with the disciples' reactions of not really understanding and refusing to do anything with that information and with this experience they've had. which calls us, I think, as followers of Jesus, that for those of us who have seen Jesus and experienced his glory and know his mercy and his forgiveness and his love for us, are we doing the same thing as these disciples? We're just keeping the news to them ourselves. We're too afraid to say anything. Or are we going out and proclaiming that Jesus is the King? He is God's radiant, beautiful Son, coming to make all things right again. Are we having that sort of witness with our neighbors, friends, family, within our community? And if not, why not? So that is, I think, how we're meant to understand and wrestle with this passage. And so I'm going to leave that with you, and we'll see you next time. Bye.